Amidst the scorching, relentless heat of the Kentucky wilderness, a 7-8-year-old woman was screaming in despair, her frail body tied tightly to a rusted utility pole. She wasn't the victim of a brutal gang of robbers, but the victim of Jason and Kimberly, her own flesh and blood, the children she had loved more than life itself. They left their own mother there to die a slow, agonizing death, simply to seize her home and assets. But as that shiny black Lincoln sped away, they didn't realize one crucial thing. They weren't leaving behind a corpse, they were leaving behind a living witness. And what happened next would unleash a brutal reckoning, both of conscience and the law, for these ungrateful children. Before we dive into this satisfying conclusion, let us know where you're joining us from. Do you believe that those who sow the wind will reap the whirlwind? Let us know in the comments below. Martha had 78 years behind her when her life took a turn she never could have imagined in her worst nightmares. That August morning had started like any other, in her modest one-story house on the outskirts of Lexington. She had woken up early, as was her custom for more than 50 years, when her late husband Arthur still woke up beside her, and together they would have breakfast while planning the day. But Arthur had died 7 years ago, and since then, Martha lived alone in that house that was once full of laughter, animated conversations, and the aroma of the meals she prepared with so much love for her family. Now the room seemed too big, too empty, and the silence was so profound that sometimes Martha turned on the radio simply to hear human voices, even if they were strangers talking about news she barely cared about. That specific morning, Martha had dressed with special care. She had put on her blue dress with white flowers. The one Arthur always told her looked beautiful on her because it brought out the color of her eyes, which, despite the years, were still a light green shade reminiscent of the bluegrass meadows in spring. She had combed her hair with care, gathering her long silver hair into a low bun, leaving a few loose strands framing her face, lined with the wrinkles that life and experiences had drawn on her skin. Her children had called the night before. Well, to be exact, it had been Jason, her eldest son, who had made the call. His voice sounded tense, rushed, as always. Jason was 45 years old and worked as a manager at a construction firm. He was always busy, always running from one place to another, always with his phone in his hand, taking important calls that couldn't wait. "Mom," he had said, without preamble, without asking her how she was or if she had eaten well. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., we're coming to pick you up. Kimberly and I have to talk to you about something important. It's about the house and your future. We need to make some decisions." Martha had felt a knot in her stomach upon hearing those words. Decisions? What kind of decisions? But she hadn't had a chance to ask because Jason had already hung up, probably to take another one of those urgent calls that seemed to control every minute of his life. Kimberly was her younger daughter, 3 years younger than Jason. She was 42 and worked as an accountant at a prestigious firm in downtown Louisville. She was an elegant woman, always impeccably dressed, with her hair cut in the latest fashion and nails perfectly manicured. But her eyes, which once shone with the innocence of childhood, now seemed hard, calculating, as if she were constantly evaluating the monetary value of everything around her. Martha had stayed up late that night, turning over in her mind what her children would want to talk to her about. She looked at the photographs covering the living room walls, Jason and Kimberly, as children, smiling, innocent, hugging her with that unconditional love that only children can give. At what moment had they changed so much? When had their visits gone from weekly to monthly, and then became so sporadic that sometimes 3 or 4 months passed without them showing up at her house? The next morning, Martha was ready by 8:30. She had made herself a cup of chamomile tea to calm the nerves she felt in her stomach. She looked out the living room window, hoping to see Jason's car appear, a brand new black Lincoln he had bought the previous year, and of which he spoke with more pride than he had ever shown when talking about his own personal achievements. At 10 o'clock sharp, just as Jason had promised, the black car appeared in front of her house. Martha felt a flutter of emotion in her chest. Despite everything, despite the distance that had grown between them, they were still her children, the babies she had carried in her arms, whom she had cared for during the nights when they were sick, whom she had taught to walk, to talk, to be good people. She left the house with her small purse hanging from her arm, locking the door with a key, as she always did. The August sun was already starting to heat up with force, but there was a pleasant breeze moving the leaves of the trees in the small garden she tended with dedication. Jason got out of the car, but he didn't come closer to greet her with a hug as he used to do years ago. He simply nodded and opened the back door of the vehicle for her. "Hi, Mom," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Get in. We have to go somewhere so we can talk quietly." Kimberly was in the passenger seat typing something on her smartphone. She looked up for barely a second when Martha got into the car. "Hello, Mother," she said dryly, without smiling, before returning her attention to her phone screen. Martha felt a chill run down her spine despite the heat. There was something in the atmosphere, a palpable tension that made the air inside the car feel dense, heavy. She tried to start a conversation. "How have you been? I haven't heard from you in weeks." "Jason, how is Jennifer and the kids?" "Kimberly, is everything still going well at your job?" Jason kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles looked white. "Everyone is fine, Mom," he replied in a monotone voice. "Very busy. You know how life is." "Yes, we're all very busy," added Kimberly without looking up from her phone. "Not everyone has the luxury of staying at home all day, doing nothing." Kimberly's words fell on Martha like ice water. Doing nothing? She got up every day, cleaned her house, tended her garden, cooked her own meals, paid her bills with the modest Social Security check she received. That was doing nothing? But she decided not to respond. She didn't want to start an argument. She looked out the window watching as the houses of her neighborhood were left behind. She recognized the route they were taking toward downtown Lexington. But after a few minutes, Jason took a detour she didn't expect. "Where are we going?" she asked with a hint of concern in her voice. "To a quiet place where we can talk without interruptions," replied Jason, and something in his tone made Martha's heart start beating faster. They kept driving, moving further and further away from the city. The paved streets gave way to dirt roads. The houses disappeared, replaced by empty lots, and eventually, by the arid landscape of the wild backroads surrounding the city. "Jason, I don't like this," said Martha, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are we going so far? Could we talk at a coffee shop? At a diner?" "Shut up, Mom," snapped Kimberly, turning to look at her with eyes full of fury. "For once in your life, just shut up and let us make the decisions." Martha felt as if she had been slapped. Never in her entire life had either of her children spoken to her that way. Tears began to form in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of them. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The car kept moving along that lonely highway in the middle of nowhere. On both sides, the dry, cracked earth extended as far as the eye could see. Dry weeds and thistles dotted the landscape, and the midday sun was beginning to turn the interior of the vehicle into an oven despite the air conditioning. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Jason stopped the car in the middle of nowhere. A few yards from the road was a rusted utility pole, one of those old poles that had once illuminated that route but was now abandoned, forgotten like relics of better times. "Get out of the car, Mom," ordered Jason, his voice devoid of any emotion. "What? Why, Jason? What is happening?" Martha's voice was now trembling with fear. Kimberly got out of the car and opened the back door roughly. "We told you to get out. Don't make us repeat it." With trembling legs, Martha got out of the vehicle. The Kentucky heat hit her like a solid wall. The air was so heavy and humid she felt like she was suffocating, her lips cracking in seconds. She looked around, looking for some sign of civilization, some house, some other car, but there was nothing, only the endless fields and that utility pole, standing like a silent sentinel in the midst of the desolation. Jason opened the trunk of the car and took out a thick rope. Martha felt her legs were about to give way under her weight. No, please, what are you going to do?" Her voice was barely a whisper drowned out by terror. "What we should have done years ago," replied Kimberly coldly. "Free ourselves from the burden you represent." The following scenes unfolded like a nightmare from which Martha could not wake up. Jason and Kimberly dragged her toward the utility pole. She tried to resist, tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the immensity of the wilderness. There was no one who could hear her, no one who could help her. With mechanical movements, as if they were performing any ordinary task, her own children tied her to the pole. The ropes squeezed her wrinkled skin, cutting off circulation to her arms. Tears finally began to roll down her cheeks, leaving shiny trails on her dusty face. "Why?" she managed to articulate between sobs. "What have I done to deserve this? I raised you with love. I gave you everything I had." "Exactly. interrupted Jason, his face a mask of resentment. You gave us everything you had, but it was never enough. It was never what we wanted. And now you're old, sick, useless. Taking care of you would cost money we aren't willing to spend. Your house is worth a lot of money, Mom, added Kimberly, pulling a document from her purse. Here is the deed. We are going to sell it. We already found a buyer who is willing to pay a good price for the land. With that money we can live better, without worries. Martha couldn't believe what she was hearing. All this was for money, for a house, for a piece of land. But it's my house, she said between sobs. It's where I lived with your father, where you grew up. All our memories are there. Memories don't pay the bills, replied Jason dryly. And you already lived your life. Now it's our turn. And what? What is going to happen to me? Asked Martha, although deep in her heart she already knew the answer. A heavy silence settled between them. Jason and Kimberly looked at each other, and in that exchange of glances, Martha could see the truth. They had no plan for her. They were leaving her there to die, for the sun, thirst, hunger, or some wild animal like a coyote to finish what they didn't have the courage to do directly. You can't do this, whispered Martha. I am your mother. I carried you in my womb. I gave you life. And now we are returning the favor, said Kimberly with a cruel smile. We are freeing you from the burden of continuing to live a life that no longer makes sense. Jason and Kimberly began walking back to the car. Martha struggled against the ropes, screamed, begged, cried, reminded them of every sacrifice she had made for them, every sleepless night when they were sick, every meal she had skipped to ensure they had enough, every dream she had abandoned to give them a better education. But her words fell on deaf ears. Jason started the car engine. Kimberly got in without looking back even once, and then the black vehicle began to pull away, kicking up a cloud of dust that enveloped Martha in a golden mist that stung her eyes and throat. No, please, don't leave me here. Jason, Kimberly. Her screams were heart-wrenching, full of a primal desperation that only someone who has been betrayed in the cruelest way by those she loved most can feel. The car got smaller and smaller in the distance until it finally disappeared completely, swallowed by the rolling horizon of the backcountry. It is truly heartbreaking to imagine the terror Martha must be feeling, watched by the very children she raised as they drive away. But as hopeless as this moment seems, Martha's story is far from over. In fact, help is coming from the most unexpected place. As the silence of the wilderness descended upon her, a cruel film reel began to play in Martha's mind. She didn't see the dry weeds or the rusted pole. She saw Jason at 5 years old, bringing her a dandelion with a gap-toothed smile. She felt the weight of Kimberly's sleepy head on her shoulder after a nightmare. How many times had she starved herself so they could have new shoes? How many prayers had she whispered over their fevers? The physical thirst that began to parch her throat was nothing compared to the drought in her spirit. She realized then that the monsters weren't hiding in the dark. They had been sitting at her dinner table for years, masking their greed with hollow smiles. The realization broke something inside her that she wasn't sure could ever be fixed. And Martha was left alone, completely alone, in the middle of nowhere, tied to a rusted utility pole under the relentless midday sun. The silence that followed was deafening. There were no birds singing, no traffic noise, no human voices, only the occasional whistling of the wind, lifting small clouds of dust and rustling the dry leaves of the bushes scattered across the arid landscape. Martha let her head drop, her chin touching her chest. The tears continued to flow, but now silently. She no longer had the strength to scream. Her throat was dry, scratchy, and every breath hurt. The blue dress with white flowers she had chosen with such care that morning was now covered in dust, and the humidity made the fabric stick uncomfortably to her skin. She thought of Arthur, her late husband. What would he have said if he had seen this? If he had seen what his own children, the kids he had loved with all his heart, were doing to their mother? The pain in her chest wasn't just from the heat or the ropes squeezing her arms. It was a deeper, more visceral pain. It was the pain of a betrayal that cut to the soul. The sun continued its relentless ascent toward the zenith of the sky. Martha could feel her skin beginning to burn under the direct rays. Her lips cracked more and more. Thirst began to make itself present, a scratchy sensation in her throat that she knew would only get worse as the hours passed. How much time would pass before someone found her body? Days, weeks, or perhaps never? This road was clearly abandoned, forgotten by progress. The yellow lines on the pavement were almost completely worn away. The asphalt had deep cracks where dry weeds grew. There were no signs that any vehicle had passed through here in a long time. A turkey vulture began to circle over her head. Martha watched it with a mix of fascination and horror. Was it possible that her life would end like this? After 78 years of existence, of fighting, of loving, of sacrificing, would she end up as food for the buzzards in the middle of nowhere? She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image of that scavenger bird circling patiently in the sky. Memories began to parade through her mind, memories of happier times. She remembered the day she met Arthur at a town dance when she was barely 20 years old. He had been so handsome in his dark suit and shy smile. They had fallen in love almost instantly, in that intense and pure way that only young people can fall in love. She remembered their wedding, a simple but beautiful ceremony in the small Baptist church in her town. They didn't have much money, but they had love, and at that moment that had been enough. They had been so happy that day, so full of hope and dreams about the future they would build together. She remembered Jason's birth, the 27 hours of labor she had endured without a complaint, because she knew that in the end, she would hold her baby in her arms. And when she finally saw him, so small, so perfect, with his tiny fingers and wrinkled face, she knew she would give her life for him without hesitating a second. 3 years later, Kimberly had been born. Another difficult labor, but one that had been worth it when they placed her on her chest, and she felt that overwhelming love that only a mother can feel for her child. Her family was complete. Arthur worked hard at a factory, and she took care of the house and the kids, ensuring they never lacked anything. When had things changed? When had her sweet babies turned into these cold and calculating strangers who had abandoned her in the wilderness? Martha searched her memory, trying to find the exact moment when everything had started to go wrong. Maybe it had been when Jason started college. He had gotten a scholarship to study engineering in the big city. He had come back for holidays that first year, but he was already different. He talked about things she didn't understand, about opportunities and success, about making money and climbing the ladder. He was no longer the boy who sat in the kitchen telling her about his day while she cooked dinner. And Kimberly had always been the more ambitious of the two. Since she was little, she had wanted more than they could give her. She was ashamed of the modest house where they lived, of the clothes that weren't name brand, of the old cars Arthur drove. When she got her job at the accounting firm, she had practically cut all ties with her family, visiting only on special occasions and always in a hurry to leave. Arthur had noticed it too in his last years of life. When illness was already consuming him slowly, he had expressed his sadness over the distance he felt with his adult children. Martha had told him one night, his voice weak but charged with emotion, "I worry about what will become of you when I'm not here. Jason and Kimberly are no longer the children we raised. They have changed. Promise me you will take care of yourself, that you won't give them everything without keeping anything for yourself." She had promised him. She had promised she would be okay, that she would take care of herself. But how could she have guarded against this? How could she have protected herself from the evil of her own children? The hours passed slowly. The midday sun gave way to the afternoon sun, equally relentless, equally cruel. Martha felt her consciousness beginning to cloud. Dehydration, extreme heat, emotional shock, everything combined to push her body beyond its limits. Her head hung forward, her breathing was shallow and labored. The ropes tying her had cut off circulation to her arms, which she now felt completely numb. She was no longer crying. She had no more tears to shed. She felt empty, like a vessel from which all its contents had been spilled. At some point she began to hallucinate. She seemed to see Arthur walking toward her through the heat haze, smiling with that warm smile she had loved so much. He reached his hands out to her, and Martha tried to reach him, but the ropes kept her in place. "Arthur," she whispered with a broken voice. "Arthur, help me!" But the figure vanished, dissolving into the hot air rippling over the pavement. Martha felt a pang of disappointment so deep it threatened to submerge her in total darkness. And then, just when she was about to give up completely, let the darkness envelop her and take her far from this horrible place, far from the pain and betrayal, she heard a sound that at first she thought was another hallucination, the sound of an engine. She opened her eyes with difficulty, her vision blurred and full of dark spots. In the distance, Moving toward her through the mirage created by the heat was a vehicle. It wasn't Jason's black car. It was an old green pickup truck with faded paint moving slowly down the cracked highway. Martha tried to scream, but her dry throat only produced a weak croak. She tried to move her arms, but the ropes held her firmly attached to the pole. She could only watch with her heart beating painfully in her chest as the truck approached. Would they see her? Would they stop, or would they drive past, leaving her to die in this God-forsaken place? The truck was getting closer and closer. Martha could see now that it was an old vehicle, probably from the 82nds, with worn paint and some dents on the body. In the truck bed there were boxes and tools, as if the driver were a worker or a farmer. And then, miraculously, the truck began to slow down. It was stopping. Someone had seen her. A man got out of the truck. He was dark-skinned, with a strong build, his face weathered by the sun and calloused hands of someone who has worked hard all his life. He wore worn blue jeans and a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His black hair was peppered with gray, and his dark eyes opened with surprise and horror when he saw Martha tied to the pole. "My God," he exclaimed, running toward her. "Ma'am, what happened to you? Who did this?" He began working immediately on the ropes, his fingers strong but gentle, as he tried to loosen the knots Jason had tied so firmly. Martha felt she was about to faint. The man's voice reached her as if from very far away, muffled and distorted. "Hang in there, ma'am. Almost there. Almost free. Hold on a little longer." Finally, the ropes gave way. Martha fell forward, but the man caught her before she hit the ground. With care, he lifted her in his arms, surprised by how little she weighed, as if she were a fragile bird that could break with the slightest sudden movement. "I'll take you to my truck. I have water there. You need to hydrate." He carried her to the truck and sat her carefully in the passenger seat. He took out a bottle of water and opened it, bringing it to Martha's cracked lips. "Drink slowly. Small sips. Like that. Very good." The cool water touched Martha's tongue, and it was as if she had tasted the elixir of life itself. She wanted to drink it all in one gulp, but the man regulated the flow, ensuring she didn't choke. "I'm Charles," the man introduced himself while she drank. "Charles Mitchell. I work as a mechanic in the town about 30 miles from here. I was coming from checking some equipment at a farm when I saw you." He paused, his face showing a mix of worry and indignation. "Who did this to you? Was it a robbery? Criminals?" Martha looked at him, and in that moment, all the emotions she had been holding back, all the pain, betrayal, hopelessness, came to the surface. She began to cry again, but this time, they weren't tears of desperation, but of relief, mixed with a sadness so deep it seemed bottomless. "My children," she managed to say between sobs. "It was my own children." Charles froze, his face showing an expression of absolute disbelief. "Your children? Your own children did this?" Martha nodded, unable to say more. The words stuck in her throat, mixed with sobs that shook her whole body. Charles looked at her for a long moment, and she could see in his eyes a mix of compassion and barely contained fury. That is unforgivable," he said finally, his voice trembling with emotion. "There are no words to describe something like that." Charles's reaction mirrors exactly what we are all feeling right now. It is hard to comprehend such a level of betrayal. Thankfully, this act of kindness marks the turning point Martha so desperately needed, but her battle for justice is only just beginning. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "First, I'll take you to the hospital. You need medical attention. Afterward, we'll decide what to do." He started the truck and began driving back the way he had come toward the town. Martha looked out the window, watching as the wilderness passed by. She still couldn't believe she was alive, that someone had found her. How many hours had she been tied to that pole? 3? 4? It had seemed like an eternity. During the drive, Charles glanced at her with concern. "Are you still thirsty?" "There's more water, thank you," whispered Martha, her voice still hoarse. "Thank you for saving me. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "Don't think about that now," interrupted Charles gently. "The important thing is that you are safe, and I promise you that your children, what they did, will not go unpunished. No one deserves to be treated like that, much less a mother by her own children." His words brought a fresh wave of tears to Martha's eyes. This stranger, This man who didn't know her at all showed more compassion and more indignation for what had happened to her than her own children. The trip to town took almost an hour. Martha drifted in and out of alertness, her body and mind exhausted by the terrible ordeal. Charles kept up a constant conversation, probably to keep her awake, telling her about his job, his family, the town they were heading to. "My wife Betty and I have been married for 32 years, he said while driving. "We have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. All 3 are adults now, but they still come to visit us every week. Betty always prepares a big meal on Sundays, and we all get together. That's the most important thing for us, family." Each word was like a knife in Martha's heart. Once she too had had that. Once her children also came to visit her, to eat her stews, to spend time with her. What had changed? Why had her story ended so differently? Finally, the first houses of the town began to appear. It was a small town, one of those that seemed to have stopped in time. Low houses of brick and siding lined paved streets. There was a small town square with an old church, and some trees providing shade to the benches where some elderly folks sat talking. Charles drove directly to the town's small health clinic, a white single-story building with a faded sign that said Community Health Center. He honked the horn repeatedly as he stopped the truck in front of the entrance. A young nurse came running out, followed by a middle-aged doctor who looked alarmed. "Charles, what happened?" asked the doctor. "Dr. George, I found this lady out on the back roads tied to a utility pole. She's dehydrated and in shock. She needs immediate help." Dr. George didn't waste time asking questions. Together with the nurse and Charles, they helped Martha out of the truck and took her inside the health center. They placed her on a stretcher and began examining her immediately. "She has severe sunburns," observed the doctor while checking her arms. "Signs of advanced dehydration. Her wrists are injured from the ropes." He looked up at Charles, tied to a pole. "Who would do something like that?" "Her own children," replied Charles, his voice loaded with contempt. "Oh, that's what she told me, doctor." George and the nurse exchanged looks of horror. "I'll call Sheriff Frank," said the doctor. "This is a crime, a terrible crime." During the next few hours, Martha drifted in and out of consciousness while the doctor and nurse worked to stabilize her. They put in an IV to hydrate her. They treated her sunburns with ointments and bandages and gave her medication for the pain and shock. When she finally was more conscious and alert, she found herself in a small room in the health center. Charles was sitting in a chair next to her bed, and there was another person in the room, an older man in a police uniform with badges indicating he was the town sheriff, Mrs. "Martha," said Sheriff Frank with a gentle but firm voice, "I'm Sheriff Frank. Charles has told me what happened to you, but I need to hear your version directly." "Can you tell me what happened?" Martha looked at him. For a moment she considered staying silent, protecting her children despite everything. But then she remembered their faces when they tied her to the pole, the coldness in their eyes, the cruelty in their words. No, she owed them nothing anymore. She didn't have to protect them anymore. With a trembling but firm voice, Martha began to tell the whole story from the beginning. She told him about the call from Jason, about how they had picked her up that morning, about the trip to the wilderness, about the ropes and the hurtful words. She told him about her house, about the plans to sell it, about how her children had abandoned her to die. Sheriff Frank took notes in a small notebook, his expression becoming more and more serious with each detail. "Do you have the full names of your children, their addresses?" Martha gave him all the information she possessed. Jason Miller and Kimberly Miller, she stated clearly, providing their addresses, their places of work, and every other detail she could remember. "This is attempted murder," said the sheriff when she finished abandonment with intent to cause death. "It is a very serious felony. I am going to contact the authorities in the city immediately to locate your children and arrest them." But Martha hesitated. "They are my children despite everything." "With all due respect, Mrs. Martha interrupted the sheriff. "What they did has no justification, none. And if they aren't punished, they could do the same to another person, or they could come back and try to hurt you again." He was right. Martha knew it, but still a part of her, that part that had been a mother for more than 40 years, felt a sharp pain at the idea of her children being arrested. Charles, who had remained silent during the conversation, leaned forward in his chair. "Mrs. Martha," he said with a soft voice, "I know this is difficult, but you have to think about yourself now. They didn't think about you when they left you in the weeds. They didn't think about everything you had done for them. They only thought about the money, about the house. They don't deserve your protection." Martha closed her eyes, feeling tears roll down her cheeks. Charles was right. The sheriff was right. She had to be strong. She had to allow justice to run its course. "Do what you have to do, Sheriff," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. Making that choice had to be incredibly painful for a mother. Yet it was the only way to ensure they couldn't hurt anyone else. Stay tuned, because Jason and Kimberly aren't going to go down without a fight, and their next move is even more shocking. The sheriff nodded with approval. "I'll make some calls right now. Meanwhile, you rest. Dr. George says you need to stay here at least a couple of days to ensure you recover completely." After the sheriff left the room, Charles stayed a moment longer. "Mrs. Martha," he said, "my wife Betty will come to visit you tomorrow. She'll bring you some things. Clean clothes, home-cooked food. You aren't alone. You aren't alone anymore." His words brought a new torrent of tears, but this time they weren't tears of pain, but of gratitude. This stranger, this kind man who owed her nothing, was offering her more compassion and care than her own children had given her in years. "Thank you," whispered Martha. "Thank you, Charles. I don't know how I can pay you for." "You don't have to pay me anything," interrupted Charles with a warm smile. "This is how things should be. This is how people should treat each other. With kindness, with compassion. Especially with our elders, with those who gave us life and raised us." After Charles left, Martha was left alone in the small room of the health center. Through the window she could see the evening sky tinged with orange and pink hues. The sun was finally setting, bringing with it a respite from the brutal heat of the day. She touched the bandages on her wrists, where the ropes had cut her skin. She could still feel the burning of the sunburns on her face and arms, but she was alive. Miraculously, she was alive. She thought of Jason and Kimberly. At this moment, they were probably in their houses eating dinner, watching television, sleeping peacefully in their comfortable beds. Would they think of her? Would they feel any guilt or remorse? Or would they simply go on with their lives as if nothing had happened? As if they hadn't left their own mother to die on a back road? The door to the room opened softly. It was the nurse who had helped earlier. "Do you need anything, Mrs. Martha? More water? Something for pain?" I just want to know," said Martha. "How could I raise children capable of doing something like that? Where did I fail?" The nurse approached and took her hand gently. "You didn't fail at anything," she said firmly. "A mother's love cannot create cruelty in a child's heart. That is something they chose. They made those decisions. It's not your fault. It will never be your fault." Martha wanted to believe those words. Desperately, she wanted to believe them, but doubt continued to gnaw at her heart. Had she been too permissive, too lenient? Had she loved them too much, and that had made them selfish? "Rest now," said the nurse, adjusting the sheets around Martha. "Tomorrow will be another day, a new beginning. A new beginning." The words echoed in Martha's mind as she finally allowed exhaustion to overcome her, and she slipped into sleep. She dreamed of Arthur with his warm smile and strong hands. In her dream, he hugged her and whispered that everything would be okay, that she was strong, that she would survive this. And for the first time on that terrible day, Martha allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a reason Charles had found her. Maybe her story hadn't ended on that utility pole in the wilderness. Maybe, against all odds, this new part of her life was just beginning. The next morning arrived with a softness that contrasted dramatically with the horror of the previous day. The first rays of sun filtered through the curtains of the small health center room, painting golden patterns on the white walls. Martha woke up slowly, disoriented at first, not recognizing where she was. Then everything came back to her like an avalanche. The black Lincoln, the desolate road, the ropes, the cold faces of Jason and Kimberly. Her whole body tensed with the memory, and her breathing accelerated. But then she felt the softness of clean sheets, the relief from pain thanks to the medication, and she remembered Charles, Sheriff Frank, the kindness of strangers who had saved her. The door opened softly, and Dr. George entered with a reassuring smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Martha. How do you feel today?" "Sore," admitted Martha. "But alive." "I'm alive, and I will remain so," assured the doctor while checking her vital signs. "Your blood pressure is stabilized, hydration is improving, Burns are responding well to treatment." He paused and looked at her with warmth. "You have a strong spirit, Mrs. Martha. Not everyone would survive what you went through." Martha didn't feel particularly strong. She felt broken, betrayed, as if a fundamental part of her being had been torn out by the roots. But she nodded weakly, thanking the doctor's kind words. "Sheriff Frank will come later this morning," continued the doctor. "He has news for you, and Charles called too. He said his wife Betty would come to visit you after breakfast." Breakfast consisted of a mild broth and some toast, the only thing her stomach could tolerate after the terrible experience. The nurse, who had introduced herself as Olivia, stayed with her while she ate, chatting about trivial things that helped distract Martha's mind from the whirlwind of emotions she felt. "The town is small," said Olivia, while adjusting Martha's pillow, "but the people are good. Everyone looks out for each other. When you arrived here yesterday, the news spread quickly. Many people have asked about you, wanting to know if you're okay, offering help." Martha felt a lump in her throat. Strangers worried more about her than her own children. It was a realization that hurt as much as the burns on her skin. Around 10 inches the morning, the door opened, and a woman of about 55 years old entered with brown hair tied in a braid and warm eyes that radiated kindness. She was carrying a large bag and smiling with genuine friendliness. "Mrs. Martha," she said softly, "I'm Betty, Charles's wife. My husband told me what happened to you. I came to bring you some things I thought you might need." Betty approached the bed and began taking things out of her bag. A clean, soft cotton nightgown, new underwear still with tags, a hairbrush, a small mirror, some magazines, and a plastic container full of homemade biscuits that were still warm. "You didn't have to do this," said Martha, her voice broken by emotion. "You don't know me. You have no obligation." "It's not an obligation," interrupted Betty, taking Martha's hand in hers. "It's the right thing to do. It's human. When Charles told me what your children did to you," she shook her head in disbelief. "I couldn't believe it. How can such cruel people exist?" And to their own mother. The two women looked at each other for a long moment, and in that silent exchange, something extraordinary happened. Betty saw the deep pain in Martha's eyes, and Martha saw the genuine compassion in Betty's. It was as if in that instant they formed an invisible but strong bond. "I'm a mother of 3, continued Betty, sitting in the chair next to the bed. "And I can't even conceive the idea that any of them could do something like that to me. You must be devastated." "I am," admitted Martha. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. "I feel like my heart has been ripped out. I raised them with so much love, with so much dedication. I gave them everything, and this is what I get in return." Betty offered her a clean cloth handkerchief, one embroidered by hand with delicate flowers in the corners. "A mother's love is unconditional," said Betty softly. "But that doesn't mean children have the right to take advantage of it. What they did wasn't just cruel, it was monstrous, and I hope they pay for it." They talked for more than an hour. Betty told her about her own family, about her children who came every Sunday to eat, about how she and Charles had raised their children with values of respect and gratitude. She told her about the town, about the close-knit community that existed there, so different from the lonely and isolated life Martha had been living in the city. "When you recover," said Betty before leaving, "I would like you to come to dinner at our house. Charles also wants to see you again. Make sure you're okay. We are here for you, Mrs. Martha. You are not alone anymore." After Betty left, Martha stood looking at the things the woman had brought her: the clean nightgown, the biscuits, the embroidered handkerchief. They were simple gestures, but they meant more to her than all the money in the world. They meant that there was still goodness in the world, that there were still people who cared about others without expecting anything in return. Around noon, Sheriff Frank arrived with news. His expression was serious, and Martha felt her stomach shrink with anxiety. "Mrs. Martha," began the sheriff, sitting in the same chair where Betty had been, "my colleagues in the city have located your children. Jason Miller was found at his workplace this morning. Kimberly Miller was arrested at her apartment. Both are now in police custody." Martha felt a confused mix of emotions. Relief because they couldn't hurt her again. Sadness because they were her children, her flesh and blood, and a small, barely perceptible spark of satisfaction because they would finally face the consequences of their actions. What is going to happen now?" she asked with a trembling voice. They will be formally charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and elder abuse, explained the sheriff. These are very serious charges that could result in considerable prison sentences. He paused. But we need your full testimony. We need you to tell us everything in as much detail as possible. We will also need you to come to the city when you are recovered enough to make an official statement and eventually to testify at trial. Trial? Martha hadn't thought that far ahead. The idea of being in a court, facing Jason and Kimberly face to face, having to publicly relate her terrible experience, was overwhelming. Yes, ma'am. If you decide to proceed with charges, there will be a trial. Your children have the right to defend themselves, although frankly I don't see what defense they could present given what they did. The sheriff leaned forward. But I need you to understand something important. You have every right to drop the charges if that is what you wish. It is your decision. No one will pressure you to go forward if you don't want to. Martha looked out the window at the clear blue morning sky. She thought of Jason when he was a boy, when he fell off his bike and ran to her arms crying, seeking comfort. She thought of Kimberly when she was a teenager, when she fought with her friends and came to talk to her for hours, seeking advice. When had they transformed into the cold and calculating people who had abandoned her in the wilderness? I'm not going to drop the charges, she said finally, her voice firmer than she expected. What they did was wrong, terribly wrong, and if they don't face consequences, if I simply forgive them and let them go on with their lives, what would that teach them? That they can do whatever they want no matter who they hurt. The sheriff nodded with approval. It is a brave decision, Mrs. Martha, and I want you to know you have our full support. The police, the district attorney, we are all on your side. During the next 2 days, while Martha recovered at the health center, events unfolded rapidly. The media found out about the story. It was the kind of news that captured public attention. An elderly woman, abandoned by her own children in the wilderness to die. Reporters began arriving in the town, looking to interview her. Dr. George and Sheriff Frank formed a protective barrier around Martha, refusing to allow journalists to bother her while she recovered. But even from her small room, Martha could see the headlines in the newspapers Olivia showed her. Cruel children, abandoned mother in wilderness. Elderly woman miraculously saved after being tied to utility pole. Attempted murder. Children wanted to inherit mother's house while she was still alive. The story spread across entire pages with photos of the road where Charles had found her, of the utility pole she had been tied to, and unfortunately also photos of her being taken to the health center. Martha felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her worst moment was being exhibited for the whole world to see. But letters also arrived, hundreds of them. People from all over the country wrote to express their support, their indignation at what had happened to her, their admiration for her strength. Some letters included money, small amounts people sent to help her. Others included prayers, poems, drawings from children who had heard her story and wanted to make her smile. Betty came to visit her every day, sometimes accompanied by Charles. They brought homemade food, more clothes, and most importantly, they brought company. They talked for hours, and slowly, Martha began to feel she was forming a new family. Not a blood family, but a family of the heart. The third day after the rescue, Dr. George declared that Martha was recovered enough to be discharged, but added with concern, "Where will she go?" "Her house in the city. I understand her children intended to sell it." "Do you have a place to stay?" That was a question Martha had been asking herself. Her house, the house where she had lived with Arthur, where she had raised her children, was it still hers? Had Jason and Kimberly already sold it? The sheriff had assured her a legal hold had been put in place to stop any sale. But even so, the idea of returning to that house, of being alone there with all those memories, was unbearable. "She can stay with us," said a voice from the door. Martha looked up and saw Betty and Charles standing in the doorway. Betty had a determined expression on her face. "We have an extra room in our house," continued Betty. "You can stay with us as long as you need until you decide what you want to do, until this whole legal matter with your children is resolved. You don't have to be alone. I can't impose like that," protested Martha weakly, although her heart leapt with hope at the offer. "It's not an imposition," insisted Charles. "It would be an honor to have you in our house. Betty and I have talked about it and we both agree. Besides," he added with a smile, "Betty says she cooks better when there are more people to feed. You'd be doing us a favor. Martha looked between the two kind faces in front of her and felt that her heart, which had been shattered by the cruelty of her own children, was slowly beginning to heal, thanks to the kindness of these strangers who had become something much more important. "Thank you," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks once more. "Thank you. I accept." And so, that same afternoon, Martha left the health center, accompanied by Betty and Charles. Olivia, the nurse, came out to say goodbye, hugging her tightly. "Take care, Mrs. Martha," she told her. "And remember, you are stronger than you think." Betty and Charles's house was in the center of town, a wood frame house painted a soft yellow with blue window frames. There was a small garden out front with colorful flowers that Betty tended with care, and a porch with 2 wooden rocking chairs where, according to Betty, she and Charles sat every evening to watch the sunset. The interior of the house was cozy and clean, with simple but well cared for furniture. The walls were covered with family photos, weddings, baptisms, graduations, happy moments captured in time. Martha felt a pang of nostalgia for the days when her own house had been that full of life and love. The room they showed her was small but perfect. It had a twin bed with a colorful handmade patchwork quilt, an antique wooden dresser, and a window overlooking the backyard garden. It was simple, but it was cozier than any place Martha had been in years. "Take your time to settle in," said Betty. "Dinner will be in a couple of hours. Our children are coming tonight. We told them about you, and they are eager to meet you." After Betty and Charles left her alone, Martha sat on the bed, feeling the softness of the quilt under her hands. She looked around the small room, and for the first time since waking up in that terrible car heading to the wilderness, she allowed herself to feel a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her life hadn't ended. Maybe a new chapter was beginning. It wouldn't be the chapter she had imagined. It wouldn't include her biological children, those she had raised with so much love, only to be betrayed in the cruelest way. But it would include these kind people who had shown her that there was still light in the world, that there were still reasons to keep going. She got up and went to the window. The afternoon sun bathed the garden in golden light. She could see Charles working in a small shed, probably repairing some tool. She could hear Betty in the kitchen, the comforting sound of plates and pots as she prepared dinner. Martha placed her hand on the window glass, feeling the heat of the sun on her palm. Yes, she thought. Yes, she could do this. She could survive, she could heal, and maybe someday she could even thrive again. But first, she would have to face Jason and Kimberly. She would have to look them in the eyes in that court and tell her story. She would have to be strong in ways she had never had to be before. And with the help of Charles, Betty, and all the kind people she had found in this small Kentucky town, Martha knew she could do it. It is truly heartwarming to witness Martha finding the love and respect she deserves with the Mitchells, proving that family is defined by loyalty, not just blood. However, this peaceful interlude is merely the calm before the storm. As she prepares to return to the city, she has no idea that Jason and Kimberly are concocting a defense strategy so deceitful it will leave the entire courtroom in shock. Will her truth be enough to silence their lies? 2 weeks after being rescued from the wilderness, Martha found herself sitting in the back seat of Charles's car, traveling back to the city where she had lived her entire life. Sheriff Frank was in the passenger seat, reviewing some documents in a manila folder. The day of her official statement had arrived. Today she would have to go to the police station, sit in front of a district attorney and several detectives, and tell her terrible story once more, this time so it would be officially recorded as part of the criminal case against her children. Martha looked out the window, watching as the landscape gradually changed from the rural backroads to the outskirts of the city. Every mile they got closer made her anxiety grow. The 2 weeks she had spent at Betty and Charles's house had been a balm for her wounded soul. The quiet routine of the town, the meals shared with the Mitchell family, the evenings on the porch watching sunsets, everything had contributed to her beginning to heal, both physically and emotionally. Betty and Charles's children had come that first night, just as Betty had promised. There were 3. Mason, the oldest, 30, who worked as a teacher at the town school, Caleb, 27, who helped his father at the mechanic shop, and Harper, the youngest, 23, who was studying nursing in the city but came every weekend to visit her parents. The way they treated Betty and Charles, with genuine respect and evident affection, had been like a mirror reflecting everything Martha had lost with her own children. But instead of feeling envy or bitterness, she had felt a strange warmth. These young people had welcomed her with open arms, calling her Miss Martha with respect, listening to her story with indignation, offering her their unconditional support. "Our parents taught us that family isn't just blood," Mason had said that night. "Family is who is there when you need them most, and they are here for you. So that makes you part of our family too." Those words had touched something deep in Martha's heart. She had cried that night in her small room, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude mixed with the bitter realization of what her own children had chosen to throw away. Now, as the car entered the familiar streets of Lexington, Martha felt her stomach shrink. This was the city where she had lived for more than 50 years. She knew every street, every corner. There was the market where she used to buy fresh vegetables. There was the park where she took Jason and Kimberly when they were kids. Every place had a memory, and every memory was now tinged with pain. "Are you okay, Miss Martha?" asked Charles, looking at her in the rearview mirror with concern. "Yes," she replied, although her voice trembled slightly. "Just nervous." "It's completely normal," said Sheriff Frank, turning to look at her. "It's going to be hard. I'm not going to lie to you about that. But remember, you are not alone. I will be with you during the entire statement. The district attorney is a good man, Mr. Richard. He understands how traumatic this is for you." They arrived at the Central Police Station, a gray concrete 3-story building that looked intimidating and impersonal. Charles found a place to park, and they all got out of the vehicle. Martha stopped a moment looking at the building, gathering her courage. Betty had given her a rosary that morning before leaving. "So you know you aren't alone," she had said, placing the beads in Martha's hands. "God is with you, and we are too in spirit." Martha touched the rosary in her pocket, feeling the smooth beads under her fingers, and that gave her the strength she needed to start walking toward the entrance. The interior of the police station was full of activity. Officers came and went. Phones rang constantly. There was a constant murmur of conversations. Sheriff Frank guided her through the bustle to an elevator that took them to the second floor. The second-floor hallway was quieter. Walls painted institutional beige, numbered doors on both sides. The sheriff stopped in front of the door, marked number 205, and knocked softly before opening. The room was small and windowless. There was a long table with several chairs around it. At one end of the room was a camera mounted on a tripod. A man of about 50, with perfectly combed gray hair and dressed in a dark suit, stood up to greet her. "Mrs. Martha," he said with a voice warm and professional at the same time. "I'm District Attorney Richard. Thank you for coming today. I know this isn't easy for you." Martha shook his hand and sat in the chair he indicated. Charles asked if he could stay, and the DA nodded, indicating a chair in a corner of the room. "We are going to record your statement," explained DA Richard. "It's standard procedure. I simply want you to tell me in your own words, and with all the details you can remember, exactly what happened that day. Take your time. If you need a break at any moment, just tell me." The camera turned on with a blinking red light. The DA started with basic questions. Her full name, her age, her address. Then gradually the questions became more specific and more difficult. Martha began narrating the events of that terrible day. Every word was like ripping a scab off a wound that was barely starting to heal. She described the phone call from Jason the night before, the distant tone of his voice. She described how she had gotten ready that morning, excited because she would see her children without knowing the horror that awaited her. Her voice broke when she described the moment she realized they were driving toward the boonies, far from the city, far from any help. "I asked where we were going," she said, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. Jason didn't answer. "And Kimberly?" "Kimberly told me to shut up." Her tone was so cold. She had never spoken to me like that. Never. The DA handed her a box of tissues and waited patiently while she composed herself. "When we got to that place in the middle of nowhere, when Jason took those ropes out of the trunk of the car, that was when I really understood. They were going to leave me there. They were going to abandon me to die." She described how they had tied her to the pole, how she had begged, how she had tried to remind them of all the good times they had shared as a family, but none of her words had penetrated the cold armor of greed that seemed to envelop her children. "Kimberly took out some papers," continued Martha. "She said they were the deeds to my house. She said they had already found a buyer, that they were going to sell it and use the money to live better. As if my life, my home, the memories of 50 years with their father, as if none of that mattered. Only the money mattered." D.A. Richard took notes meticulously, occasionally asking questions to clarify certain details. Exactly what had they said? What were the ropes like? Were there specific threats? Martha answered every question as best she could, although there were moments when her memory clouded, overwhelmed by the emotion of the memory. Finally, she described how the car had driven away, kicking up that cloud of dust that seemed to swallow whatever hope she had left. She described the hours under the brutal sun, the thirst that became unbearable, the pain of the ropes cutting her skin, the buzzards circling over her head. "I thought I was going to die there," she said, with a voice barely audible. "I thought that would be my end, abandoned by my own children. The children I had carried in my womb, nursed, cared for when they were sick. And I wondered constantly what I had done wrong, how I had failed as a mother, so they could do something like that to me, Mrs." Martha interrupted the DA with a gentle but firm voice. "I want you to listen to this very carefully. You didn't fail. What your children did was not the result of a failure of yours. It was a decision they made, a terrible and criminal decision. But it was their decision, not yours." His words were similar to those the nurse Olivia and Betty had told her, but Martha still struggled to believe them completely. Guilt was a heavy burden that refused to abandon her completely. Then she described the rescue, the green truck approaching, Charles getting out and running toward her, his hands working to free the ropes, the cool water that had saved her life. The full statement took almost 3 hours. When it finally ended, Martha felt completely exhausted, as if she had run a marathon. The DA turned off the camera and thanked her for her bravery in telling her story. "Your testimony is crucial," he said. "With this, along with Charles Mitchell's testimony and the physical evidence we have, we will build a solid case. Your children are going to face justice, Mrs. Martha, I promise you." Sheriff Frank accompanied her to a small waiting area where Charles waited with coffee and something to eat. Martha could barely swallow, her throat closed by the emotion of having had to relive those terrible moments. "The hard part is over," said the sheriff, trying to comfort her. "Now we just have to wait for the case to go to trial. That will probably be in a few months." But there was something else. D.A. Richard entered the waiting area a few minutes later with a serious expression on his face. "Mrs. Martha, there is something you need to know. Your children's lawyers have requested they be granted bail while awaiting trial. The hearing to decide on bail is tomorrow afternoon." Martha felt as if ice water had been dumped on her. Freedom. Could they get out? "It's a possibility," admitted the DA, "but I'm going to fight with everything I have against it. What they did is a violent crime. They are a danger to you, but the judge has the final word." The idea that Jason and Kimberly could be free, could walk the streets while she lived with the trauma of what they had done to her, was almost unbearable. "If they are released," continued the DA, "they will have restraining orders. They won't be able to come near you in any way. But I understand your concern, and we will do everything possible to ensure they remain detained until trial." That night, back at Betty and Charles's house in town, Martha barely slept. She tossed and turned, imagining terrible scenarios. What if Jason and Kimberly were released? What if they came looking for her? What if they tried to finish what they had started in the wilderness? Betty noticed her distress at breakfast the next morning. "He's not going to let them hurt you," she said firmly. "Neither Charles nor I will allow it. This whole town won't allow it. Everyone knows your story now. If your children set foot here, 100 people would see them and warn us immediately." Her words offered some comfort, but anxiety continued to gnaw at Martha's stomach. The bail hearing was the next day. D.A. Richard called that afternoon to give her the news. His voice sounded tense, frustrated. "The judge granted bail," he said. "Jason paid $50,000. Kimberly paid $40,000. Both have been released with strict restraining orders. They cannot come within 500 yards of you. They cannot contact you in any way, directly or indirectly." Martha slumped into a chair, feeling her legs couldn't support her. But continued the DA, "I have to tell you something else. There have been interesting developments. Both have made public statements through their lawyers. They claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that they never intended to abandon you, that they simply wanted to take you to a quiet place to talk about your future, and that when they got to the back road, you had an episode. They say you suffer from dementia and became violent, and that they tied you temporarily to prevent you from hurting yourself while they went to get help." Martha couldn't believe what she was hearing. Violent dementia? That is, That is a complete lie. I don't have dementia. And they didn't go to get help. They left and left me there to die. I know, Mrs. Martha. I believe you completely, and we have evidence contradicting their story. Dr. George examined you extensively and found no signs of dementia. You are completely lucid and competent. But this is the defense strategy they are going to use. They are going to try to paint you as a confused elderly woman who doesn't remember events correctly. And people are going to believe them. It is infuriating to see them try to twist the narrative and use Martha's age against her after everything they did. But as they prepare their lies for court, they have no idea that a crucial piece of evidence is about to expose their greed for everyone to see. Martha felt her world wobbling. Not if I can help it, replied the DA with determination. We have Charles as a witness. He found you tied to that pole in the middle of nowhere, hours after your children left you there. That doesn't sound like going to get help. We have the injuries on your wrists, where the ropes cut your skin. We have the severe sunburns. All that is evidence that you were there for hours. And we have your clear and detailed testimony of what happened. After hanging up the phone, Martha sat in silence for a long time. Betty and Charles surrounded her, offering words of comfort, but she barely heard them. The betrayal was now deeper. They hadn't just abandoned her to die. Now they were trying to destroy her credibility, to make her look like a senile old woman who didn't know what she was saying. They aren't going to win, said Charles with a firm voice. The truth always comes to light, and the truth is you are a strong, lucid woman, and they tried to kill you out of greed. No judge or jury is going to believe their lies. But Martha wasn't so sure. She knew Jason and Kimberly were persuasive when they wanted to be. She knew they could act. They could cry crocodile tears. They could convince others they were the victims in this situation. The following days were tense. Martha barely left the house, fearful of running into someone who knew her children, or worse, Jason and Kimberly themselves. The town felt safe, but every time she heard a car pass on the street, her heart raced. One afternoon, about a week after her children were released on bail, the phone rang at Betty and Charles's house. Charles answered, and Martha saw his expression turn serious, concerned. It's for you, he said, covering the receiver with his hand. She says she's a journalist who wants to talk to you about your story. Martha hesitated. D.A. Richard had advised her not to speak to the media yet, to wait until after the trial, but there was something in Charles's expression that made her take the phone. Yes, Mrs. Martha? My name is Michelle Torres. I'm a reporter for the Kentucky Gazette. I've been following your case and, well, there is something I think you should know. Your children gave an interview yesterday. It was published this morning. In it, they claim you had been emotionally manipulating them for years, that you constantly asked for money, that you threatened to disinherit them if they didn't meet your demands. Martha felt the room spinning around her. That's not true. I never asked them for money. I lived on my pension and I never manipulated them. How can they say those things? I know, Mrs. Martha, and that's why I'm calling. I want to give you the chance to tell your side of the story. I think the public needs to hear the full truth. Would you be willing to talk to me? Martha looked at Charles and Betty, who had been listening to the conversation. Charles nodded slowly. The truth needs to be told, he said. If they are going to lie publicly, you have the right to defend yourself. And that was how 2 days later, Martha found herself sitting in Betty and Charles's living room, opposite a woman of about 35, with a recorder between them. Michelle Torres had warm eyes and a gentle way of asking questions that made Martha feel comfortable quickly. For 2 hours, Martha told her whole story, not just the events of that terrible day in the wilderness, but her whole life. She told her about Arthur, about the early years of their marriage when they had been poor but happy. She told her about the birth of her children, about how she had raised them with love and sacrifice. She told her about how the relationship had begun to deteriorate as Jason and Kimberly grew up and became more ambitious, more materialistic. I just wanted their love, said Martha, tears rolling down her cheeks. I just wanted them to visit me once in a while, to call to see how I was. I didn't ask them for money. I didn't manipulate them. I just wanted to be their mother, and they decided it was more convenient for me not to exist. Michelle listened attentively, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just letting Martha talk. There is something I want to ask you, said Michelle when Martha finished. After everything they did to you, after the cruelty and betrayal, Is there any part of you that still loves them, that wishes you could forgive them? It was a profound and painful question. Martha remained silent for a long time, searching inside her heart for an honest answer. "Part of me will always love them," she said finally. "They are my children. That will never change completely. But the love I feel now is mixed with so much pain, so much disappointment. I don't know if I can ever forgive them. I don't know if I want to forgive them. What they did was unforgivable, and they have to face the consequences of their actions." The interview was published on the front page of the newspaper 3 days later. It was extensive, covering 2 full pages with photographs of Martha, of the spot in the wilderness where she had been abandoned. And to Martha's surprise, also photographs of her with Betty and Charles, showing the new family she had found. The headline read, "A Mother's Love Betrayed, the True Story of Martha." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper received hundreds of letters of support for Martha. Social media filled with comments condemning Jason and Kimberly. A small protest even sprung up in front of the firm where Jason worked, with people holding signs that said, "Greed is no excuse for crime and justice for Martha." DA Richard called to inform her that the publicity was playing in her favor. "The jury will be selected from the general population," he explained. "And thanks to this interview, public opinion is completely on your side. That puts pressure on the judicial system to ensure justice is done." But the publicity also had an effect Martha hadn't anticipated. Jason and Kimberly responded through their lawyers with a statement that was equally published in the newspapers. In it, they presented themselves as loving children who had only wanted the best for their mother, who were devastated by the accusations, who loved her deeply despite her having changed in her later years. "Our mother suffers from mental health issues," said the statement. "We have tried to get her help, but she refuses. This incident on the back road was a terrible misunderstanding. We never intended to harm her. We just wanted to talk to her about moving to a place where she could receive the care she needs. But she became violent, and in the chaos of the moment we made decisions that we now deeply regret." It was a carefully constructed narrative, designed to generate sympathy and doubt. Martha read the statement with a mix of disbelief and fury. "How can they lie like that?" she asked Betty. "How can they say those things so easily?" "Because they are desperate," replied Betty. "They know what they did was terrible. They know the evidence is against them. So they are trying to build a defense, no matter how many lies they have to tell and if people believe them." Martha felt fear growing in her chest. "The truth always prevails," said Betty with conviction. "It may take time. It may be a painful process. But in the end, the truth always comes to light." Martha wanted to believe that. Desperately, she wanted to believe it. But she had lived enough to know the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes bad people won, that sometimes justice wasn't served. All she could do now was wait for the day of the trial to arrive, hope she would have the chance to look Jason and Kimberly in the eyes in front of a judge and jury and tell them exactly what she thought of them and what they had done. Meanwhile, she lived day to day in Betty and Charles's house, trying to find moments of peace in the middle of the storm her life had become. She helped Betty in the kitchen, listened to Charles's stories about his years as a mechanic, played cards with them in the evenings, and slowly, very slowly, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be a future for her beyond this pain. A future where she could genuinely smile again, where she could sleep without nightmares, where she could trust people again. But first, she would have to go through the trial, and that, Martha knew, would be the hardest test of all. 6 months after that terrible day in the wilderness, Martha found herself standing in front of the imposing courthouse. It was a gray stone building with tall columns and marble steps that seemed designed to intimidate. The sky above her was cloudy, threatening rain, as if even the weather reflected the emotional weight of the day. Charles and Betty were by her side, one on each side, like protective guards. Also present was Harper, the youngest daughter of the Mitchells, who had asked for the day off from her studies to accompany Martha on this crucial day. "Ready?" asked Charles softly. Martha nodded. Although ready wasn't exactly the right word, she would never be ready for this, to face the children she had loved with all her heart, to hear the lies they would surely tell. But she had to do it for herself, for her dignity, and for all the other mothers in the world who had been mistreated by their children. They walked up the steps slowly. Martha had carefully chosen her clothes for this day, a navy blue 2-piece suit that Betty had helped her buy. Comfortable, but elegant shoes, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wanted to look respectable, dignified, competent, not like the senile old woman her children tried to portray. The interior of the courthouse was a maze of marble hallways, numbered doors, and hurried people carrying briefcases and folders. D.A. Richard waited for them on the second floor, in front of courtroom number 3. "Good morning, Mrs. Martha," he greeted with a reassuring smile. "How do you feel?" "Terrified," admitted Martha honestly. "It's completely normal," assured the DA. "But I want you to remember something important. You only have to tell the truth. That is all. You don't have to worry about anything else. The truth is enough." He explained briefly how the trial would proceed. First, opening arguments from both sides. Then, the prosecution would present its witnesses and evidence. Then the defense would have its turn. Finally, closing arguments and jury deliberations. "You will be my main witness," said the DA. "You will probably testify on the second or third day of the trial. The defense lawyers will try to discredit you, try to confuse you with their questions. But stay calm. Answer honestly. Don't let them pressure you into saying something that isn't true." The courtroom doors opened. It was a large room with a high ceiling and dark wood panels on the walls. There were rows of benches for the public that were already filling up with curious journalists. And Martha noticed with a pang in her heart some familiar faces, neighbors from her old neighborhood, people who knew her, who knew Jason and Kimberly when they were kids. The jury was seated in a raised section to one side of the room, 12 people of different ages and backgrounds, all looking forward with serious expressions. They would be the ones to decide the fate of Jason and Kimberly. And then Martha saw them. Her children were sitting at the defense table, each flanked by a lawyer dressed in an expensive suit. Jason wore a dark gray suit that made him look professional and respectable. Kimberly wore a conservative beige dress, with her hair combed back in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable. When Martha entered the room, they both turned to look at her. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Martha searched their faces for some sign of remorse, some sign of the guilt they surely must feel. But she saw nothing, only coldness. Kimberly even offered her a small, sad smile, as if she were a concerned daughter watching her poor sick mother. It was pure acting, and Martha felt a wave of nausea. She sat in the section designated for victims and witnesses with Charles, Betty, and Harper around her, like a protective shield. The murmur of conversations filled the room as everyone settled. "All rise," announced the bailiff when the judge entered the room. He was a man of about 60, with completely white hair and an expression suggesting he had seen all kinds of cases throughout his career. He sat at his elevated bench and banged his gavel once. "Court is in session. The People versus Jason Miller and Kimberly Miller. Case number 7516. D.A. Richard, you may proceed with your opening statement." D.A. Richard stood up and walked to the center of the room, where everyone could see him clearly. He opened a folder and began to speak with a clear, strong voice. "Your Honor, members of the jury, what you are about to hear is a story that will break your heart. It is a story about betrayal in its purest form, about greed that led two people to commit an act so cruel, so inhumane, that it is hard to believe it could be real." He paused, letting his words resonate in the room. Martha is a 7-8-year-old woman, a widow, mother of 2 children, whom she raised with love and sacrifice. Throughout her life, she did what good mothers do. She put her children's needs above her own. She gave them education, food, a home. She gave them unconditional love. The DA walked toward the table where Jason and Kimberly were, pointing at them, and these 2 individuals, her own children, decided that their mother was no longer useful to them. They decided that the house where she lived was worth more than her life. So, on an August day last year, they drove her to the wilderness, tied her to a utility pole, and left her there to die of dehydration, heat stroke, or to be devoured by wild animals. Several jury members made gestures of disgust. One, a middle-aged woman, even brought her hand to her mouth in horror. "During this trial," continued the DA, "you are going to hear Mrs. Martha's testimony. You are going to see the photographs of her injuries. You are going to hear from the man who found her and saved her. You are going to see indisputable physical evidence of what happened that day. And in the end, I am going to ask you to do justice, to declare these 2 individuals guilty of premeditated attempted murder." The DA returned to his seat. The judge nodded and addressed the defense. Defense attorney, your opening statement. Jason's lawyer stood up. He was a man of about 40 with dark hair, perfectly combed, and a smile that Martha found almost reptilian. Members of the jury. He began with a soft, reasonable voice. The story you just heard sounds terrible, and if it were true, I myself would want to see my clients punished. But here is the problem. It is not true. Not in the way the prosecution is presenting it. He walked toward the jury, speaking directly to them as if they were old friends. The truth is much more complicated and much sadder. Martha is without a doubt a woman who deserves compassion. But she is also a woman who, unfortunately, has been suffering from cognitive decline for the last few years. Early-stage dementia. Her children, my clients, had been worried about her. They had been trying to convince her that she needed help, that she needed to move to a place where she could be properly cared for. Martha felt her blood boil. Cognitive decline, dementia, were blatantly lies. That August day, continued the lawyer, Jason and Kimberly took their mother for a drive, hoping to have a difficult conversation with her in a quiet place, far from the distractions of the city. But when they arrived at the area where they stopped, Mrs. Martha had an episode. She became agitated, violent even. In an attempt to prevent her from hurting herself or them, they secured her temporarily to the pole. Then Jason told Kimberly to drive back to the city to get professional help while he stayed with his mother. The lawyer paused dramatically. But when Kimberly returned with medical help barely an hour later, her mother was no longer there. Someone had found her and taken her. And in her confusion, in her deteriorated mental state, Mrs. Martha constructed a different narrative of what had happened. A narrative in which her loving children are cruel villains. Lie, shouted Martha, unable to contain herself. That is all a lie. The judge banged his gavel loudly. Order. Mrs. Martha, understand that you will have your chance to testify, but for now you must remain silent. Charles took Martha's hand, squeezing it gently. She was trembling with fury and frustration. The lawyer continued with his false narrative, painting Jason and Kimberly as concerned and dedicated children who had only made the mistake of underestimating the severity of their mother's mental condition. It was a masterful performance, and Martha could see that some jury members seemed to be considering his words. When the lawyer finished and sat down, D.A. Richard called his first witness, Charles Mitchell. It is terrifying to watch how easily a skilled lawyer can twist the truth, making a victim look like the villain to a jury that doesn't know better. Martha's outburst, while understandable, is exactly what the defense wanted. But don't lose hope yet. Charles is about to take the stand. Will his simple honesty be enough to shatter the defense's perfectly constructed lie? Charles walked to the stand with firm steps. He looked uncomfortable in the suit Betty had made him buy for the occasion, but he spoke with a clear and direct voice when the DA began asking him questions. Mr. Mitchell, please tell the jury exactly what you saw the day you found Mrs. Martha. Charles described how he had been driving down that lonely back road, how he had seen the figure tied to the utility pole, how he had run toward her, initially thinking it was a heat-induced hallucination. She was in terrible condition, said Charles, his voice loaded with emotion, sunburned, dehydrated, with her wrists bleeding where the ropes had cut her skin. She was barely conscious. If I had passed by there an hour later, I don't think she would have survived. And did you notice any sign that anyone had returned to help her? Any indication that her children were waiting for medical help nearby? Asked the DA. Nothing, replied Charles firmly. There was no one else for miles around. Just her, tied to that pole like an abandoned animal. The defense lawyer stood up for cross-examination. Mr. Mitchell, you found Mrs. Martha around 2 inches the afternoon. Correct. Around that time, yes. And at what time had her children left her there, according to her testimony? Charles hesitated. I'm not sure exactly. She was very disoriented when I found her. Exactly, said the lawyer with a smile. So it is possible, isn't it true, that she had been there only an hour or even less time, given her injuries, the level of dehydration, the sunburns? She had to have been there several hours. But you aren't a doctor, are you, Mr. Mitchell? You aren't qualified to make those kinds of determinations. I don't need to be a doctor to see when someone has been cruelly abandoned, replied Charles, his voice rising slightly. The judge intervened. Mr. Mitchell, please limit your answers to the questions asked. The cross-examination continued for almost an hour, with the lawyer trying to sow doubt about the credibility of Charles's testimony, suggesting that maybe he had misinterpreted the situation, that maybe he had arrived right after the children left to get help. But Charles stood firm, over and over again. He repeated what he had seen. An elderly woman, abandoned in the wilderness, tied to a pole without water, without protection, without any sign that anyone planned to return for her. The next witness was Dr. George, who described Martha's medical condition when she was brought to the health center. He showed photographs of her injuries enlarged on a big screen so the jury could see them clearly. The images were shocking. Martha's wrists cut and bleeding, her skin burned and blistered by the sun, the bruises where the ropes had pressed against her body. Several jury members made gestures of horror upon seeing the photographs. "In my professional medical opinion," said Dr. George, "these injuries are consistent with someone who was tied up for an extended period, exposed to the elements of the wilderness for at least 3 to 4 hours, possibly longer." The defense lawyer tried to question his assessment, suggesting that maybe he had exaggerated the severity of the injuries, but Dr. George had her complete medical records, photographs dated and time-stamped, physical evidence that could not be disputed. The first day of the trial ended with the testimony of Sheriff Frank, who described how he had been alerted to the case, how he had investigated, how he had located and arrested Jason and Kimberly. "And when you arrested the defendants, did they show any concern for their mother's well-being?" asked the DA. "No," replied the sheriff. "In fact, when I informed them their mother had been found alive, they both seemed surprised, not relieved." Surprised. That night, back at Betty and Charles's house, Martha could barely eat. The day had been emotionally exhausting, seeing her children, hearing their lies, reliving the horrors of that day. "You did well staying calm," said Betty while serving her chamomile tea. "I know it was hard hearing all those lies." "I don't know if I can do this," admitted Martha. "Tomorrow or the day after will be my turn to testify. I'll have to sit there in front of them, in front of all those people and tell my story. And if the jury doesn't believe me, what if they think I really have dementia?" "Dr. George already testified that you have no sign of dementia," reminded Charles. "Your cognitive exams were perfect. They can't use that against you." "They can try," said Martha bitterly. "They can try to paint me as a confused old woman, and some people will want to believe them." "Why?" "Because it is easier to believe an old woman is senile than to believe that children can be so cruel." Harper, who had been listening in silence, approached and took Martha's hands. "Miss Martha," she said with a soft but firm voice, "I was in that courtroom today. I saw the faces of the jury when they saw your photographs. I saw how they reacted when they heard the testimonies. They aren't buying the defense's lies. The truth is obvious to anyone paying attention." Martha wanted to believe that. Desperately, she wanted to believe it. The second day of the trial began with more expert testimony. A forensic psychologist testified about the psychological profile of people capable of committing crimes against their own parents. He spoke about greed, narcissism, the complete lack of empathy required to do something like that. Then an expert on ropes and knots testified, explaining how the knots found in the ropes that had tied Martha required certain strength and knowledge to make. They weren't loose knots someone would make hurriedly to protect an agitated person. They were knots designed to keep someone firmly in place. Finally came the moment Martha had been fearing and anticipating at the same time. D.A. Richards stood up and said the words that made her heart beat like a drum in her chest. "The prosecution calls Martha to the stand." With trembling legs, Martha stood up. Charles squeezed her hand once before letting go. She walked to the stand, feeling everyone's eyes in the room on her. She sat in the chair and placed her hand on the Bible while the bailiff asked her to swear, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "I do," she said with a clear voice, stronger than she expected. D.A. Richards started with soft questions, establishing who she was, her life story, her relationship with her children when they were small. Martha spoke about the good times, about how Jason and Kimberly had been happy and affectionate children. She spoke about Arthur, about their marriage, about the sacrifices they had both made to give their children a better life. "And when did you start noticing changes in your relationship with your children?" asked the DA. "Gradually," replied Martha. "When they went to college. When they started their careers, they began visiting me less. The calls became more spaced out. When they came, they always seemed in a hurry to leave. It was as if..." as if I had become an annoying obligation instead of their mother. Then came the hard part. The DA asked her to describe the events of the day she was abandoned. Martha closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage. Then she began to speak, her voice trembling but firm. She described Jason's phone call, the excitement she had felt that finally her children wanted to spend time with her. She described the trip to the back roads, the growing sense of fear when she realized they were driving too far out. She described the terrible moment when Jason took out the ropes, when she understood what they were planning. "I begged them," said Martha, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. "I reminded them of every happy moment we had shared. I reminded them how I had cared for them when they were sick, how I had worked overtime to buy them the school supplies they needed, how never had I failed them when they needed me." Her voice broke, and the DA offered her a glass of water. Martha drank a sip before continuing. "Kimberly told me to shut up. She told me I wasn't useful anymore, that I was old, and taking care of me would cost money they weren't willing to spend. Jason didn't even look me in the eyes while tying me up. It was as if I wasn't his mother anymore, as if I were just an annoying object they needed to get rid of." Several jury members had tears in their eyes. An older woman who reminded Martha of her own deceased mother wept openly. The DA showed her the photographs of her injuries, asking her to confirm they were images of her taken the day she was rescued. Martha nodded, looking at the images with a mix of horror and sadness. It was hard to believe that battered and burned woman in the photographs was herself. Finally, the DA asked Mrs. Martha, "Is there any possibility you misinterpreted your children's intentions that day? Any possibility that they were really trying to help you and something went wrong?" Martha looked him directly in the eyes. Then she turned her gaze toward the jury. "No," she said with absolute certainty. "There is no possibility of that. I know exactly what happened that day." Standing up to her abusers took immense courage, proving that Martha is not the frail victim they tried to portray. However, the trial isn't over yet, and the prosecution is about to reveal a document that will silence Jason's defense once and for all. "I know exactly what they said, and I know they left me there expecting me to die. The only reason I am alive today is because Charles Mitchell had the compassion my own children didn't have." The cross-examination was brutal. Jason's lawyer tried to confuse her with rapid-fire questions, trying to make her contradict herself on details. Exactly what time did they arrive at the back road? How long was she tied to the pole? Did you hear Kimberly specifically say they were leaving her to die? Did you see Jason drive back to the city? Martha answered every question as best she could, admitting when she wasn't sure of a specific detail, but standing firm on the main facts. "Mrs. Martha," said the lawyer with an almost compassionate voice, "is it possible the traumatic experience distorted your memories? That in the confusion and heat of the day, you misinterpreted what your children said or did?" "No," replied Martha firmly. "I know what they said, I know what they did, and no trauma is going to erase that from my memory." The cross-examination lasted almost 2 hours. It was exhausting, frustrating, and at several moments Martha felt she was on the verge of breaking. But every time she felt she was about to give in, she looked toward where Charles, Betty, and Harper were seated and found the strength to continue. Finally, the judge declared a recess for lunch. Martha almost collapsed when she stepped down from the stand. Charles was there immediately, holding her up. "You did incredible," he whispered in her ear. "You were perfect." During the recess, DA Richard met with them in a small conference room. "Your testimony was powerful, Mrs. Martha," he said. "The jury was completely engaged. I saw their reactions. They believed you." "And what happens now?" asked Martha, exhausted. "Now the defense will present their witnesses. They will probably call Jason and Kimberly to testify. They will have their chance to tell their side of the story. But you already planted doubt about anything they say. The jury has heard your testimony first, and it was convincing." The rest of the day was dedicated to defense witnesses. A former neighbor testified she had noticed Martha sometimes seemed confused, although she admitted under cross-examination that her interactions with her had been minimal and superficial. A doctor hired by the defense testified about dementia and cognitive decline, although he also had to admit under questioning that he had never personally examined Martha. It was obvious the defense was trying to build a narrative of reasonable doubt, but each of their witnesses was easily discredited by DA Richard during cross-examination. The third day of the trial began with the moment everyone had been waiting for. Jason Miller took the stand. He wore his best suit, had his hair perfectly combed, and when he swore to tell the truth, his voice sounded firm and sincere. He was the image of a respectable, professional man, someone you could trust. His lawyer began with questions designed to make him look like a loving and concerned son. "Jason, tell the jury about your relationship with your mother." "I love my mother deeply," said Jason. And Martha almost choked on the hypocrisy of those words. She has always been a strong, independent woman, but in recent years we noticed changes. She became more forgetful, more irritable. "My sister and I were worried." He continued weaving his web of lies. He described how they had tried to convince Martha she needed help, that she should consider moving to a place with more care. He described how she had rejected all their suggestions, becoming increasingly hostile. "That August day," said Jason, his voice loaded with fake emotion. "We just wanted to have an honest conversation with her. We thought maybe in a quiet place, away from distractions, she would finally listen to us." "And what happened when you got to the wilderness?" "My mother became very agitated. She started screaming, hitting us. We were worried she would hurt herself. And now I realize, it was a terrible mistake. We secured her temporarily to the pole while we decided what to do." "And then what?" "I told Kimberly to drive back to the city to get medical help. I planned to stay with my mother, but she convinced me it would be better if we both went, so we could explain the situation completely to the medical professionals. So we left planning to return in less than an hour with help." It was a masterful performance. Jason even had tears in his eyes when he described his supposed horror at discovering later that his mother was no longer in the place where they had left her. "I felt devastated," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought we had lost her, that something terrible had happened to her. And when the police arrested me, I couldn't believe what I was being accused of. Never would I want to hurt my mother. I love her." DA Richard stood up for cross-examination with an expression of cold determination. "Mr. Miller, you say you love your mother. Is that correct?" "Yes, of course." "And when was the last time you visited her?" "Before the day you took her to the wilderness." Jason hesitated. "It had been some time. I was busy with work." "How much time specifically?" "Maybe 3 or 4 months." 4 months without visiting your mother, whom you claim to love so much. Interesting. And how many times did you call her during those 4 months?" "I'm not sure exactly." Martha sat in the gallery, her hands gripping the wooden bench until her knuckles turned white. She wasn't listening to the lawyer's strategy anymore. She was studying the face of the man on the stand. It was the same face she had kissed 1,000 times, yet she realized with a chilling clarity that she was looking at a stranger. There was no remorse in his eyes, only the panicked calculation of a trapped animal. Seeing him sweat, seeing him lie so effortlessly about loving her while his debts were exposed, didn't bring her the satisfaction of revenge. Instead, it brought a profound, quiet grief. It was the funeral of her motherhood. In that moment, the umbilical cord was finally, painfully cut. She wasn't losing a son today. She was realizing she had lost him years ago to the cold idol of greed. And for the first time in months, she felt the heavy chains of guilt fall from her shoulders. It wasn't her fault. It had never been her fault. "No, that's not true." "Then explain this." The DA pulled a document from his folder. "This is a sales contract for your mother's property, dated 2 weeks before the day you took her to the wilderness. Can you explain how you planned to sell a house that didn't belong to you while your mother was still living in it?" This is the moment where their web of lies finally unravels. Proof that this wasn't an accident, but a calculated plan based on greed. If you're rooting for Martha, keep listening, because the judge's final sentencing is going to be exactly what they deserve. Jason was speechless. His face paled and his hands trembled visibly. We were going to talk to her about that." "Talk to her, or get rid of her so she couldn't object?" "Objection," shouted the defense lawyer. "The prosecutor is badgering the witness." "Sustained," said the judge. "DA Richard, moderate your tone." But the damage was already done. The jury had seen the documentary evidence. They had seen Jason sweating and stuttering, unable to provide a coherent explanation. The cross-examination continued for another hour, with the DA systematically dismantling every part of Jason's story. By the time he finally finished, Jason looked like a destroyed man, his mask of concerned son completely shattered. Kimberly was called to the stand next. Her strategy was slightly different. She cried a lot, talking about how much she loved her mother, about how this terrible situation was a misunderstanding. But the DA was equally prepared for her. He pulled out bank statements showing Kimberly also had financial problems. He showed text messages between Jason and Kimberly from weeks before the incident, where they specifically discussed the value of their mother's house and how they could solve the problem of her not wanting to sell. "We need to find a permanent solution." Read the DA from one of the messages. "What exactly did permanent solution mean, Miss Miller? We just wanted to convince her." Convince her or eliminate her? "We never said anything about eliminating her. But that was the plan, wasn't it? Take her far enough away, leave her in conditions where she wouldn't survive, and then inherit her property?" No, that's not true. But her denial sounded hollow, especially when the DA presented more messages, more evidence of the planning that had occurred before that fatal day. Closing arguments were presented the fourth day of the trial. The defense lawyer did his best to sow reasonable doubt, arguing it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that his clients had made errors in judgment, but not crimes. But DA Richard was devastating in his closing argument. "Members of the jury," he said, walking in front of them. "During this trial, you have heard two very different stories. On one hand, you have the story of Jason and Kimberly Miller, a story that changes according to the evidence presented, a story full of contradictions and convenient forgetfulness." He turned toward where Martha was sitting. "And on the other hand, you have the story of Martha, a story that has been consistent from the first moment, a story backed by physical evidence, photographs of her injuries, testimony from the man who found her, medical records, text messages showing her children's planning." He paused, letting his words resonate. "This case is not complicated. It is simple and heartbreaking. Two people decided money was more important than their mother's life. They made a conscious decision to take her to the wilderness and leave her to die. Only by luck, by the kindness of a stranger, did she survive to tell us the truth." He walked toward the defense table, pointing at Jason and Kimberly. "These individuals do not deserve your compassion. They do not deserve the benefit of the doubt. What they deserve is to face justice for the horrible crime they committed. I ask you to view the evidence clearly, to listen to your consciences, and to return a verdict of guilty on all charges." The judge gave his instructions to the jury, explaining the law, defining legal terms, describing how they should deliberate. Then the jury retired to begin their deliberations, and then began the wait. Jury deliberations lasted 2 full days. 2 days of agony for Martha, who waited in a small hotel near the courthouse, along with Charles and Betty. She couldn't eat, could barely sleep. Every hour that passed felt like an eternity. "What does it mean they are taking so long?" she asked Charles on the morning of the second day. "Does it mean they aren't sure, that maybe they believed Jason and Kimberly?" "Not necessarily," replied Charles, although his own concern was visible. "A case like this, with such serious charges, requires careful deliberation. It's a good sign they are taking their time to consider all evidence." DA Richard kept them informed. He called every few hours to tell them there was still no verdict, that the jury had asked to review certain evidence, that they had asked the judge questions about specific legal definitions. "This is all normal," he assured them. "We just have to be patient." But patience was almost impossible. Martha found herself constantly reviewing her testimony in her mind, wondering if she had said something wrong, if she had forgotten to mention some important detail. Betty tried to distract her with conversations about other topics, about plans for when all this was over, about a small party they wanted to throw in her honor in town. But Martha could barely focus on anything other than the trial. The afternoon of the second day of deliberations, Charles's phone rang. It was DA Richard. "The jury has reached a verdict," he said. "You need to be in court in 30 minutes." The trip back to the courthouse was a blur. Martha felt as if she were outside her body, watching everything from a distance. Her hands trembled as she climbed the building stairs. The courtroom was even more full than during the trial. Journalists crowded the front rows. There were TV cameras outside the building. This story had captured the attention of the whole country, becoming a symbol of the growing disconnection between generations, of the danger of extreme materialism. Martha took her seat with Charles and Betty by her side. Jason and Kimberly were already there, sitting at the defense table. Both looked pale and nervous. The judge entered, and everyone stood up. Then the jury was escorted back into the room. Martha studied their faces, trying to read some clue about what they had decided, but all maintained carefully neutral expressions. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" asked the judge. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with glasses, stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. In the case of the People versus Jason Miller, how does the jury find?" The foreman looked directly at Jason. "On the charge of attempted first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." A murmur ran through the room. Martha felt her legs go weak. Charles took her hand and squeezed it tightly. "On the charge of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of elder abuse, we find the defendant guilty." The judge banged his gavel to silence the growing noise in the room. "And in the case of the People versus Kimberly Miller," the foreman turned his gaze toward Kimberly, who had tears rolling down her cheeks. "On the charge of attempted first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of elder abuse, we find the defendant guilty." Martha began to cry. They weren't tears of joy exactly, but a complex mix of relief, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of validation. The judicial system had worked. Truth had prevailed. Kimberly collapsed in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Jason had his head in his hands. Their lawyers seemed defeated, knowing this was a devastating blow. The judge set the sentencing date for 3 weeks later. Both defendants were remanded back into custody to await sentencing. While bailiffs led them out of the room, Kimberly turned to look at Martha once more. "Mom!" she shouted. "Mom, please, I'm sorry. Please, forgive us." But Martha turned her face away. She couldn't look at her, couldn't give her the comfort Kimberly sought. That bridge had been burned completely, reduced to ashes by the flames of betrayal. Outside the courthouse, journalists pounced on them. Cameras and microphones pushed toward Martha's face, while a crowd of voices shouted questions. "Missus, Martha, how do you feel about the verdict? Is there any chance you'll forgive your children? What message do you have for other families facing similar situations?" DA Richard and several police officers formed a protective barrier around Martha, guiding her toward Charles's car. But before getting into the vehicle, Martha stopped and turned toward the cameras. Everyone quieted down, waiting for her words. "Today," said Martha with a clear voice, "justice was served, but there is no victory here. There is no joy, only sadness for what was lost, for what was destroyed. For any mother or father watching this, my message is simple. Love your children, but don't allow them to abuse that love. And to children, remember your parents won't be here forever. Don't waste the time you have with them. Don't let greed or selfishness destroy the most important bonds in life." With those words, she entered the car, and Charles drove back to the town that had become her new home. The 3 weeks until the sentencing hearing passed in a kind of emotional limbo. Martha knew she had won, that her children would face consequences for their actions, but she still didn't feel completely at peace. DA Richard called to inform her that both Jason and Kimberly wanted to talk to her before sentencing. Did they want to apologize, or so they claimed? "I don't have to accept, do I?" asked Martha. "Absolutely not. It is completely your decision." Martha thought about it for days. Betty and Charles told her they would support her regardless of what she decided. Finally, she made her decision. "I'm not going to see them," she said. "I have nothing to say to them, and I don't want to hear their empty apologies. They aren't my children anymore. They chose their path when they tied me to that pole." On sentencing day, the courtroom was again packed to the brim. The judge began the hearing asking if anyone wanted to make a victim impact statement before pronouncing the sentence. Martha stood up. She had carefully prepared what she wanted to say. She approached the podium in front of the judge, but turned to look directly at Jason and Kimberly. "You two," she began, her voice steady despite tears in her eyes. "You are the people I carried in my womb for 9 months. You are the babies I nursed, whom I cared for during nights when you were sick. You are the children I taught to walk, to talk, to be good people. Or at least I tried." She paused, gathering her emotions. "I don't know at what moment money became more important to you than love. I don't know when you decided my life had no value, but what I do know is the people you became are not the people I raised, not the children I knew." Her voice rose slightly. "You left me in the wilderness to die as if I were trash, as if 50 years of loving you, caring for you, sacrificing for you meant nothing. And what is most painful isn't what you did to me physically. It is knowing you were capable of that kind of cruelty, that you could look me in the eye, and decide my death was the solution to your problems," Kimberly cried openly. Jason kept his head down, unable to look at her. "I want you to understand something," continued Martha. "I survived. I found people who showed me there is still goodness in the world, that there are still families who care for each other, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. You lost a mother who would have loved you unconditionally until my last breath. But I gained a new family that values my life, my dignity, my humanity." She turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I ask you to impose the most severe sentence the law permits, not for revenge, but to send a clear message. The lives of the elderly have value. Mothers and fathers deserve respect and care, not to be discarded when they are no longer convenient." She returned to her seat, feeling as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had said everything she needed to say. The judge took a moment before speaking, looking at the documents in front of him and then at the defendants. "Jason Miller, Kimberly Miller, stand up." Both stood up, wobbling slightly. "In my 32 years as a judge," began the judge, "I have seen many disturbing cases, but this is among the most despicable I have encountered. You didn't just try to kill your mother. You did it in the cruelest way possible, abandoning her to suffer before dying." His voice became harder. "The trust a parent has in their children is sacred. You betrayed that trust in the most horrible way imaginable, and you did it for greed, for money. There was no threat to your lives. There was no reason except your own selfishness." He looked at his documents again. "On the charge of attempted first-degree murder, I sentence each of you to 20 years in prison. On the charge of kidnapping, 5 additional years. On the charge of elder abuse, 3 additional years. Sentences will be served consecutively, not concurrently. That is a total of 28 years in prison for each of you. While 28 years is a heavy sentence, it brings a necessary sense of closure and safety that Martha has earned after such an ordeal. It's a powerful reminder that justice can prevail, even when the odds seem stacked against you." A murmur ran through the room. It was a severe sentence, but given the circumstances of the crime, completely justified. "Furthermore," continued the judge, "I order that upon your release, if that date arrives, you will have permanent restraining orders against Martha. You may not approach her, contact her directly or indirectly for the rest of your lives." He banged his gavel. "Court is adjourned." Martha felt as if she could finally breathe after holding her breath for months. 28 years. Her children would pass the next nearly 3 decades in prison. By the time they got out, she probably wouldn't be alive. It was a sad realization, but also liberating. It meant she could live the rest of her life without fear, without having to look over her shoulder, without worrying that Jason and Kimberly might try to finish what they had started. The media surrounded her again upon leaving the building, but this time Martha was prepared. She had asked the DA to prepare a brief statement. "Today, justice was done," she read from a sheet of paper. "My hope is this case serves as a warning of the dangers of valuing material possessions above human relationships. I hope it inspires families to communicate better, to care for each other, to remember that money comes and goes, but time with our loved ones is irreplaceable." She finished with a more personal note. "I want to thank everyone who supported me during this terrible period. Charles and Betty Mitchell, who took me in when I had nowhere to go, who showed me family is not just blood, but love and compassion. To the whole town that has embraced me as one of their own, and to everyone who sent letters, prayers, and words of encouragement, you have shown me that despite the evil I experienced, the world is full of much more goodness." On the way back to town, Martha looked out the car window, watching the landscape pass. It was early spring, now almost a year after that terrible day in the wilderness. The trees were blooming, filling the air with sweet scents. The world kept turning. Life went on as it always did. "What are you thinking about?" asked Betty softly from the front seat. "Everything," replied Martha. "How much has changed in a year? How different my life is now." "For better or worse?" asked Charles. Martha considered the question. She had lost her children. She had experienced unimaginable betrayal. She had been on the verge of death, but she had also found a new family. She had discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. She had learned she deserved to be loved and respected for the better, she said finally, surprising herself by the certainty in her voice. "I wouldn't choose to go through what I went through again, but it brought me here to you, to this new life." And for that, strangely, I am grateful. When they arrived in town, they were greeted by a scene Martha would never forget. The town residents had organized a celebration in her honor. The town square was decorated with banners and balloons. There were tables full of food different families had prepared. A small stage had been set up where a local band was playing music. "What is all this?" asked Martha, completely surprised. "It's for you," said Betty with a radiant smile. "The town wanted to celebrate your strength, your bravery. They wanted to show you how much you mean to all of us." As Martha got out of the car, people began to applaud. Some came over to hug her, others offered flowers. Small children handed her drawings they had made for her. The town mayor, an older man with an impressive mustache, went up on stage and asked for silence. "Martha," he said with a strong voice, "you came to our town under the most terrible circumstances. You were treated with a cruelty no one should experience. But your strength, your dignity, your refusal to be destroyed by that cruelty has inspired everyone who knows your story." The crowd applauded again. "Therefore," continued the mayor, "on behalf of all residents of this town, we want to declare you an honorary citizen. This is your home now for as long as you want to stay. You are part of our family." He presented her with a framed certificate, declaring her an honorary citizen of the town. Martha took it with trembling hands, tears rolling freely down her cheeks. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I never expected." "You don't have to say anything," said Betty, hugging her tightly. "Just accept the love. Accept that you are valued, that you are wanted." The celebration continued well into the night. There was music, dancing, food, and above all, laughter. Martha found herself surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her, who wanted to know her story beyond the headlines, who saw her as a complete person and not just a victim. At one moment in the night, Martha found herself sitting on a bench at the edge of the square, taking a break from the noise. Harper, Charles and Betty's youngest daughter, sat next to her. "Miss Martha," said the young woman, "I want you to know something. I've been studying nursing because I want to help people. But your story, what happened to you, has made me want to specialize in elderly care. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what you went through." Martha took the young woman's hand. "That is beautiful, Harper. You are going to make a wonderful difference in many people's lives." "It's thanks to you," said Harper. "Your bravery in telling your story, in fighting for justice, has opened many people's eyes to the problem of elder abuse. You have started important conversations. You have changed lives." Martha had never thought of her experience that way. She had been so focused on her own pain, on her own fight for justice, that she hadn't considered the broader impact her story could have. "If something good can come of all this," said Martha, "if my story can prevent another person from being treated like I was treated, then maybe it was worth living it." As the night advanced and the celebration began to wind down, Charles and Betty accompanied Martha back to her house. On the porch, before entering, Martha stopped and looked at the stars shining in the night sky. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "for a long time after the wilderness, I dreamed about that day constantly, nightmares where I relived every moment. But lately I've been dreaming about different things, about this town, about you, about a future not defined by what happened to me, but by what I choose to do with the time I have left." "And what do you want to do?" asked Betty softly. Martha smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a long while. "I want to live, really live. I want to spend time with the people I love. I want to help at the community soup kitchen, maybe teach some kids to cook the recipes I learned from my mother. I want to do things that matter, that have meaning. I want to show I'm not just a victim of a tragedy, I am a survivor, and my story doesn't end with what Jason and Kimberly did to me. My story continues." Charles put his hand on Martha's shoulder. "And we are going to be here with you for every chapter of that story, for as long as you want." And so it was. The following months and years brought a new life for Martha. She became a beloved figure in the town, known for her kindness, wisdom, and willingness to help anyone who needed it. She began giving cooking classes at the community center, teaching young people the traditional recipes she had learned from her own mother. She became a volunteer at the soup kitchen, preparing meals for needy families. She participated in a program where seniors read stories to children at the elementary school, becoming an adopted grandmother to dozens of children who adored her stories. Her house in the city was finally sold, but this time by her decision, with the money going directly to her account. She used part of that money to buy a small house in town, not far from Charles and Betty. The rest she donated to establish a fund in the town to help elderly adults in vulnerable situations. "The money my children wanted so much," she said when announcing the donation, "will be used to protect other people from suffering what I suffered." That seems like poetic justice to me. 2 years after the trial, Martha received a letter. It was from Kimberly. From prison, her daughter wrote asking for forgiveness, explaining she had had a lot of time to think about what she had done, begging for a chance to redeem herself. Martha read the letter once and then put it in a drawer. She didn't answer it, not because she was cruel or resentful, but because she simply no longer had room in her heart for that relationship. She had built a new life, a new family, and looking back would only bring pain. Jason never wrote. Apparently, even in prison, he maintained his pride and denial. On her 81st birthday, 3 years after that terrible day in the wilderness, the town organized a big party for Martha. The square was decorated again, and it seemed the whole town attended. There were speeches about her impact on the community, about the lives she had touched, about the inspiration she represented. There was a huge cake, music, dancing, and more love than Martha had felt in her whole life. At the end of the night, when the party began to disperse, Martha found herself standing in the same spot where Charles had found her years ago. No, where she arrived in town first. Betty approached and stood next to her. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "About how strange the paths of life are," replied Martha. 3 years ago, I was tied to a pole in the wilderness expecting to die. I was sure my life had ended, that there was no future for me. And now, look at all this. Look at what I have." She gestured toward the people still remaining in the square, laughing and talking. "I have more family now than I ever had. Not blood family, but heart family. And that I have learned is the one that really matters." "Do you ever think about them?" asked Betty softly. "About Jason and Kimberly sometimes," admitted Martha, "especially on important dates like today. I wonder if they remember my birthday. I wonder if they ever truly regret what they did, or if they only regret getting caught." She paused. "But it doesn't hurt like it used to hurt. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it does make them more bearable. And I have filled my life with so much love, with so many positive things, that there isn't much room left for pain." Betty hugged her. "You are one of the strongest people I have known, and I feel honored to call you my friend, my sister, my family." 5 years after the incident, when Martha was 83, she received an unexpected invitation. A national organization against elder abuse wanted to honor her with a special award for her bravery in speaking about her experience and for her subsequent work in raising awareness about the problem. The ceremony would be in Washington, D.C., with national media coverage. At first, Martha hesitated. The idea of reliving everything publicly again was daunting. But Charles and Betty encouraged her. "Your story needs to be told," said Charles. "There are so many older people suffering in silence, being mistreated by their families and feeling they have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. If they hear your story, if they see you survived and thrived, it could give them the courage to seek help." So Martha accepted, and on a sunny October afternoon, she found herself standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people, accepting a crystal award while the audience stood and applauded. But the most significant thing wasn't the award, it was what happened after. In the following days and weeks, Martha received hundreds of letters from people all over the country. Some were from seniors sharing their own stories of abuse or neglect. Others were from adult children, mortified by Jason and Kimberly's actions, vowing to be better to their own parents. One letter in particular touched Martha deeply. It was from a 65-year-old woman who had been emotionally abused by her daughter for years. Martha's story had given her the courage to seek help, to leave that toxic situation. Now she was living in a women's shelter, but for the first time in years, she felt hope. "You saved me," the woman wrote. "Your bravery gave me bravery. Your story showed me I wasn't alone, that I deserved better. Thank you for speaking out. Thank you for being so strong." Martha placed that letter in a special place in her home. It was a reminder that her suffering hadn't been in vain, that something positive had come out of that terrible experience. It is profoundly moving to witness how Martha transformed her deepest trauma into a lifeline for others, proving that even the darkest chapters can lead to a purposeful ending. She has truly found peace, but as time marches on, A final headline is about to arrive, one that confirms justice isn't just a moment in court, but a permanent reality. 10 years had passed since that terrible day in the wilderness. On a sunny spring morning, Martha sat on her favorite porch with a newspaper in her hands. She was now 88 years old. Her hair was completely white as snow, her face lined by time but also by the smiles of a life well lived. The newspaper headline caught her attention. Parole denied for siblings convicted of attempted murder of mother. Jason and Kimberly had applied for early parole after serving 10 years of their sentence. The parole board had reviewed their case and determined they still posed a potential risk. Their release had been denied. Martha read the article with a mix of emotions. She felt no joy at their continued imprisonment, but she felt no sadness either, only a distant acceptance that decisions have consequences. "Are you okay?" asked Betty, who, despite now being in her 72nd, remained a constant pillar of support. "Yes," replied Martha honestly. "I think so. They made their decisions. I made mine, and we both have to live with them." That afternoon, while Martha was baking cookies in her small kitchen, the doorbell rang. It was a messenger with a package. Inside was a book, a new publication on elder abuse that used her story extensively as a case study. There was also a note from the author thanking her for her bravery. Martha placed the book on the shelf next to her Bible and photographs of her chosen family. It was proof that her suffering had served a greater purpose. As the years continued to pass, Martha lived her life to the fullest. Each day was a gift. She eventually celebrated her 90th birthday, surrounded by dozens of people who loved her. Charles and Betty, now elderly themselves but still full of energy, organized a small but perfect celebration at their house. Charles and Betty's children were there, of course, but so were the students from her cooking classes, now adults with their own families. There were the children she had read stories to, now teenagers. There were neighbors, friends, community members whose lives she had touched in countless ways. As Martha looked around the room, her heart filled with an emotion so deep it threatened to overwhelm her. These people didn't share her blood. Many of them hadn't even met her before that fateful day in the wilderness. But they were her family in the truest and most meaningful sense of the word. "Happy?" asked Charles, appearing at her side with a cup of tea. "More than happy," replied Martha. "Blessed. Despite everything, despite the pain and betrayal, I am deeply blessed." That night, after everyone left, Martha sat on her porch, watching the stars as she liked to do. It was the same sky she had looked at that terrible night in the wilderness when she was tied to the pole waiting to die. But now, instead of fear and despair, she felt peace. She thought of Arthur, her late husband. He would probably be proud of her strength, heartbroken by his children's betrayal, but glad she had found happiness again. She thought of Jason and Kimberly, now serving their 12th year in prison. Had they changed? Had they learned? Martha didn't know and, frankly, didn't care that much anymore. They had made their choices. Now they had to live with the consequences. The wilderness had tried to destroy her. Jason and Kimberly had tried to erase her from existence. But she had survived. More than that, she had thrived. Sitting on her porch under the vast canopy of stars, Martha closed her eyes and took a deep, steady breath. She thought about the old Martha, the woman who had defined her worth solely by the children she raised, the woman who had begged for scraps of affection. That woman had died on the roadside pole, scorched by the sun. In her place sat a woman forged in fire, a woman who had learned that family isn't determined by blood, but by behavior. She looked at the lights of the town below, knowing that tomorrow she would feed the hungry and comfort the lonely. Her biological children had tried to empty her life, but God had used their cruelty to expand her heart in ways she never imagined. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a vessel of grace. With a smile that reached her soul, Martha whispered into the night, "You meant it for evil, but it was used for good." And in that silence, she finally found the peace that no one could ever take away. Martha, the woman her own children had abandoned to die, the woman saved by the kindness of a stranger, the woman who had rebuilt her life from the ashes of betrayal, went to sleep with a smile on her face and peace in her heart. Martha once shared a sentiment that touched millions of hearts. "I lost 2 children, but I found an entire family." Today's story comes to a close, but it reveals a timeless truth. True family isn't defined just by DNA, but by how we show up for each other in times of need. Those ungrateful children chose greed and earned themselves a prison cell. Martha chose to forgive herself and found true, fulfilling happiness. Life always offers us choices. Let's choose love over hate and generosity over calculation. If this story touched your heart, please give us a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for joining Martha on her journey to justice. Wishing you and your family peace and blessings. See you in the next video.